Well, I'm going to start similarly where Ian had started, where this text is really about when I'm referring to How to Read Like a Professor. And obviously, the whole one-story aspect of it is definitely kind of reconnected throughout the book. And I think another aspect that kind of connects all of literature, or all of, as Ms. Pucci would say, quality literature, is the symbolism and the double meanings behind everything. And I think throughout How to Read Like a Professor, he definitely touches upon that. For example, I have a quote in here, and it's in, I think, chapter 16. When they're writing about other things, they really mean sex. And when they write about sex, they really mean other things. And that's just kind of showing how, like, a good author can really use different aspects of, like, what their characters go through to symbolize deeper things than that. And sex is a good way to show, like, rebellion or sacrifice or different things like that.
Well, I think, like, in quality literature, it's not all about, like, the symbolism in, like, significant objects, such as in, like, The Great Gatsby, where the green light was heavily, like, touched upon. But with quality literature, like, the author doesn't do anything, like, on accident. Like, he does everything on purpose. Like, he crafted every single word. And, like, in Foster's book, he talks about, like, everything, like, politics, like, vampires, just, like, everything, like, from, like, nature to rain, and just, it's all hidden in, like, the novel, and he's just wants us to uncover that on a deeper level than just, like, symbolism.
I think this text is it's kind of like the one-story thing as well, but I think it's all about making connections, and Foster mentions that there's no such thing as a wholly original piece of work. But you have to always think to yourself, like, where have I seen this person before? Where have I seen this symbol or heard of this? Because Foster always wants readers to be thinking. And I think that shows, like, maturity in a reader. And I don't know if this happened for any of you guys, but while I was reading, I was able to, like, read some of, like some of the fundamentals of, like, literature that he was talking about and think about some of the other books I read. Like, when he talked about, like, communion and stuff like that, I thought about, like, The Last Supper Santiago had in The Old Man and the Sea and other stories like that.
I completely agree with that, because when I was reading, one of my questions was which classic that we read last year does the majority of this connects to? And I definitely thought Old Man and the Sea, because I had several examples. Like on page 4, they talked about heroic quests. On page 9, they're talking about biblical allusions. Page 61, they're talking about corresponding elements to the Bible, and then page 88 is a metaphor for the Bible. So I kind of think that, like, his point is just to show that, like, everything is one story, and that you can connect everything, and that's sort of the definition of a classic, is to be able to connect.
Chelsea's question connects to one of my questions, and it's like, what constitutes as a good book? Because in chapter 1, Foster talked about how a book can have, like, a hero's journey, but it was about a boy, like, getting bred. And then he talks about how, like, a story can have, like, all the allusions to the Hamlet, or have all these allusions, but it can still be technically not quality literature. So I was just wondering what everyone thinks makes a good book.
I also kind of addressed that as well when I was talking about what makes a classic a classic. And I sort of realized as I was reading this that it's not necessarily a classic's ability just to, like, the author meant a specific symbol to have a specific meaning, but that each person can bring their own individual interpretation and pull their own meaning out. So I think that's sort of what makes a classic, rather than that the author, like, intended a certain meaning, but, like, everybody just pulls their own out and then connects it together.
I think a classic can also be defined as something that can be interpreted in many ways depending on how you look at it, and that kind of connects to, like, the question number 3 with chapter 25, don't read with your eyes. And I think when you look at something like The Great Gatsby, for example, you need to look at it from the perspective of Gatsby, whereas anyone can look at that situation and say that Gatsby's a fool for doing all the things that he does for Daisy, and why is he still in love with Daisy. But unless you were Gatsby, unless you've ever experienced that kind of love or that kind of passion, then I think that you need to understand his perspective. And that can also be said for a historical background too. So when you're trying to analyze a character, you need to understand the historical time frame which the story takes place.
I agree with that. I think it connects with what he said because you just need to put yourself in the person's shoes, and it's never just words that you're reading, it's the author's message that they're trying to get across and convey to you. And I don't think it's more of you just being able to pick out, like, okay, that's symbolism. I think they also want you to see, connect it with your life, connect with their character, so it's more of an enjoyable read rather than it just drags on and you don't care, per se.
I agree with that because in, like, The Great Gatsby, when we were reading it, we saw, like, it was, like, the build-up of seeing Daisy for the first time because I remember, like, when we were reading that, it was like we were going to see someone that we haven't seen. The way that he built it up and reading it through my eyes, it was like seeing a family member that I haven't seen, but in his way, it was seeing the love of his life that left him. But
I think when you analyze the burdens on other people, it makes it more powerful.
yeah.
If you look at it from their perspective. Like, for example, in the fiction story I read, Things They Carried, like so many people read, on the second page he dives into basically the things that they carry, which can include rifle magazines to sea rations, and basically all the things that they had in their backpack, which add up from 12 to 18 pounds of equipment. And then when you add on the helmet weight, it's like another 5 pounds. So you have to like think about how awful it would be to be in a situation of fear and like, I wouldn't say loneliness, but you have to kind of find yourself and get that courage to survive. And once you just even add on all the physical aspects of carrying that weight and being in the hot sun and dealing with the mosquitoes and everything, like they need to carry mosquito repellent for it.
And the emotional part of it, when they like saw the people die, that was, not only did they have physical baggage, but they had emotional problems after.
Yeah, I agree with that because I feel like you can only notice that if you read behind like the characters, like if you read behind like someone else's eyes, I guess, because not only like some of the things they had to carry were like intangible, and like they may not have like a physical weight, but like they weighed heavy in their minds, and that's something that they had to live with. And I have a quote. He said that we don't have to accept the values of another culture to step into a story and recognize the universal qualities present there.
That kind of connects to like one of the questions that I had created myself, and after reading the Things I Carried, I had asked, is struggle and pain beneficial to learn and adapt as humans? And I think that can connect also to the whole one story aspect, is like human nature being that one story that every piece of literature can connect back to. And my personal thoughts on my own question are, it almost depends on the severity of how we are challenged. I know that coming back from war, obviously, like I have a quick quote right here. One of the soldiers, as he was driving around, I think Daniela talked about it too, driving around the lake in his hometown, he's saying to himself how he had won. He's trying to make himself feel better, and he's saying, you won 7 medals, and he says to himself, like, sure, but like, doesn't that mean you're like courageous or whatever? And he kind of reminisces about a time where he had been responsible, well, not so much responsible, but he had seen the death of a fellow soldier that he was trying to pull out of this mud, and he had lost the soldier's grip in fear of falling into the mud himself. And then he thinks about that whole time period, and he says to himself, I had the chance and I blew it, that stink is what got to me. So I think that sometimes when tragedy is so bad, it almost breaks us down, and it's almost too much to cope with.
Yeah, he suffered from extreme guilt, I think. And it's kind of like we could all agree that guilt is probably one of the worst emotions to feel. And then I also think that one of another good topics to bring up is that the Jimmy Cross, the lieutenant, he was sort of in love with the girl Martha, who didn't give like any crap about him, for lack of a better word. And he still, after so many years, after he saw her at a reunion, he still liked her, and it's just, I think it was just not sad, but it is sad because he just had the hope of her being there, like hoping that he'll have someone to come back home to, when in reality he didn't, but it was just one thing that kind of kept him going, and then he started hating her. But
I think relates to chapter 25, because you have to put yourself in his shoes to realize, like, from our perspective, wow, he's obsessive over this girl, but like taking into account like the guilt, the fear, like the like she was this beacon of light that he hoped to return to. Like he was the symbolism of hope while he was there, and like it was a way for him to escape like his situation, and that makes for like his unreliable, like most unreliable stories, where like you're like, why is he focusing on this girl instead of the situation around him, or like
That's similar to the guy that kept that stalking from.
yeah.
Like, that was just something physical that he held on to, but he was holding on to, like, the hope that he would make it out alive, and even though he died in the war, it was just, like, how strong it was that they needed something to hope for after.
And a lot of the stuff in this story is, like a big metaphor for a lot of other things, like that Mary Ann girl kind of like represented the innocence people had going into the war, but once they enter Vietnam, like they kind of like turn loose and Vietnam kind of takes them in. Or like Lieutenant Cross, he was kind of like, O'Brien kind of says in the beginning of the novel that he's like a leader. Well, he tries to come across as a leader with like strong foundations, but he kind of represents the Vietnam War because a lot of the people didn't know why they were there, and like there were like many questions. People didn't know like what the war was fighting, like what they were fighting for and stuff like that.
And like we don't know as readers like if Mary Jane really was like turned bad and like she turned dangerous when she just embraced the Vietnam culture, because these soldiers like they see Vietnam as the enemy, like it's this foreign place that they're stuck in, and they don't understand. Well, was it Rat? Like he didn't understand why Mary Jane like just embraced this, and it seemed like she was, you know, turning to the dark side, so to say.
And I think that sort of connects to the chapter. Is that a symbol? Because for question 5, you had to pick which one you think connects most. I thought that one because it sort of tells you to listen to your instincts on page 107. And when you're reading the things that carried for the first time, you sort of accept everything. But when you get to the point about Mary Ann, you sort of start to question it, and you think, wait a minute, what about what I previously read? Is that all true as well? And I think it sort of engages like how you think about books, instead of just sort of reading it methodically and just accepting it as it is. Like English class last year taught us, and history class last year taught us to like go deeper and to sort of explore whether or not the author is reliable or not.
I think the most important chapter is one story, chapter 5, because like that's one chapter that can connect like the things that they carry to like Angela's Ashes to the Great Gatsby, because all in all, like all these stories add and continue the story of humanity. And I'm sure over this year we'll be exploring a lot of literature that have different plots, but in the end, like they just carry a bigger message about human nature.
I think it's easy to connect literature with other literature. Like, just from both the conversations that have happened so far, we both made connections to like The Scarlet Letter and Great Gatsby and previous works we've already read about. So I'm sure throughout, or at least in my opinion, throughout this course, I think that one story definitely connects the most to our classroom, because everything that we read will be able to connect through different aspects of other books that we've previously read.
Like
If
we've
that
already
makes sense.
talked about like the Great Gatsby thing like from last year. It's
Exactly.
that easy.
I thought another chapter that was important was chapter 8, because like we were saying, we can connect to the Great Gatsby and stuff. Like this year when we read, we're going to want to make connections to things that we already know, and then we'll connect better with the books that we feel like we can relate to in some way. And then the chapter about heart disease, that one was just one that made me like think about last year when we read The Scarlet Letter with Arthur Dimmesdale. And with his bad heart, and it was just like it's never just heart disease, because the bad heart was like the guilt and the burden of it, and then once he confessed, it was like the release of all of that. So I found that chapter